I'm dwfearn, and this is my take on music recording. Last time, at the suggestion of listeners, I announced an experiment to evaluate and critique recordings that listeners sent in. I was pleased to have several people submit their work, and in this episode, I will offer my observations. In general, I was impressed with the high-quality work that you do. I enjoyed listening to all the songs, but since this is a critique of recording techniques, I try to avoid any comment on the music itself. But I must say, I was pleasantly surprised at how every track I received was wonderful to listen to. In the previous episode, I mentioned the difficulty of separating a critique of the music from a critique of the recording. That's because I do not see a definitive line between them. You can have the most masterful recording, but if the musical piece is not good, no one is likely to listen to it more than once. Over my career, I've had the privilege of working with some excellent, successful producers. I learned a lot sitting next to them over weeks or months of an album project. And every one of them had a different approach to using me as the engineer on their project. Some wanted me to do my job and keep my mouth shut. Others depended on me to catch the performance imperfections that were likely to bother us or cause problems later. They wanted to focus their attention on the overall feel of the performance and not be distracted by mistakes and details. I can certainly appreciate that because, ultimately, how the song feels to the listener is the most important thing. Having someone else catch the errors allowed the producer to concentrate on the music. But there is always a fine line between outright mistakes and a performance that I felt could be better. I think you know what I mean. Often the producer would depend on me to know when we had reached the best take and things were starting to go downhill. Also, whether mistakes were serious or could be tolerated or fixed later. Thus, the line between the engineer and producer depends on the working relationship between the two. More so now than in the past, the engineer is often the de facto producer or co-producer of the song. The artist may even perform the role of artist, engineer, and producer. For the critiques, I have embedded each of the songs in the podcast itself, but remember that this is pretty low-res audio. Podcasting uses a fairly low bitrate MP3. The music is going to sound pretty bad in the podcast, so if you want to hear the originals, download the full-res versions on my podcast website, dwfearn.com. Look under Extras and then click Critique Audio. There's also a link in the podcast description. Thanks to everyone who submitted their songs. It takes courage to have your work critiqued, and I appreciate that. First, some general observations that apply to most of the songs. Levels. I know the temptation to make your recording as loud as possible while still sounding good. With today's processing tools, it is a trivial task to make the loudness -10 loudness units full scale or better, and still have the song sound pretty good. But is this the best approach? Loudness is a difficult thing to measure, but the EBU method seems to be accepted as the standard. There are defined standards for broadcast which are very conservative, but music recordings are still the Wild West. Some of the streaming services normalize the music to their company's standard. Not all the same, and this is still a moving target, but my understanding is that -16 loudness units full scale is a good level to use. That's what I use for my music recording. For the podcast, I use -18. Most of the submitted songs exceed the -16 loudness units full scale, sometimes by a lot. This is a personal decision you have to make, but keep in mind that it is possible that a streaming service will reduce your recording's level by several dB to make it conform to their standard. When that happens, your highly compressed music is going to sound very small compared to the songs before and after. This loudness level is independent of the peak level. With digital, of course, there is a maximum level defined by physics. There can be no signal peak over 0 dB full scale. That level is undefined, and converters do not know what to do with it since it has run out of numbers. If the level exceeds digital 0 for an extended period, the audio is mangled and unusable. Everyone will hear that and take corrective action. But if the level is exceeded only on a single peak, it may not be that noticeable. But it's still distorted, and the effect on the listener cannot be ignored. It will be an unconscious irritant to many people. Unless you want to irritate the listener, this is best avoided. So, can we all agree that any peak over 0 dB full scale is a bad thing? If so, just about every one of the recordings submitted has peaks that exceed digital 0, sometimes multiple times. I'll tell you how I handle this problem. Your solution may be different, and I'm not convinced my way is best, but it works for me. Currently, I use Flux Elixir, but there are many others that may be similar. I set it just to catch the occasional peaks that would exceed 0. Then I set the limiter output level to -2 dB full scale. Depending on the sample rate and the nature of the material, this -2 level could be translated by the listener's D to A converter to something higher on peaks. That's because the converter is tasked with reconstructing the original waveform, which, with some transients, the waveform is only partially defined by a couple of sample points. As a consequence, the reconstructed waveform is usually about 1 dB higher, at least in the recording I do. So the -2 has become -1 dB in reality. You could probably set your limiter to -1 and probably avoid any true peaks over 0 dB. But I have found that most consumer D to A converters sound better if the level is 1 or more dB below their digital 0. 1 dB is a small price to pay for cleaner audio, in my opinion. Also, translation into a bit-compressed format like MP3 sounds a lot better to me if the level is kept 1 or 2 dB below digital peak. This discussion deserves its own episode, which I plan to do at some point, probably with a guest expert who knows a lot more about this than I do. Okay, here are the songs. They appear in the order that I received them. Quiet Nights.
Quiet nights of quiet stars, quiet chords from my guitar, floating on the silence that surrounds us. Quiet thoughts and quiet dreams, quiet walks by quiet streets, and the window that is looking on the mountains and the sea. How lovely, this is where I want to be, here with you so close to me, until the final flicker of life's ember. I was lost and lonely, believing that life was only a bitter tragic joke I've found with you. The meaning of existence, oh my love. where I wanna be. Here with you, so close to me, until the final flicker of life's ember. I was lost and lonely, believing that life was only bitter, tragic joke half found with you. The meaning of existence, so my love.
This jazz standard is beautifully recorded and sounds great to me. All the instrument sounds are appropriate for the style and the song. But my job is to get picky about the recording, so the first thing I notice is that the reverb decay time is a bit too long on the vocal. The stereo soundstage is slightly narrower than I would prefer. When you have several instruments that are equally important in the composition, we tend to put them all in the center or close to it. I like to see a bit more spread. The bass guitar sounds good, but I would like a bit more definition on the notes. Similarly, I would like to hear more resonance in the kick drum, which would fit the musical style better. The vocal has some serious distortion on peaks in several places. I can't tell if this is in the mic, the preamp, or subsequent processing, but it's very obvious. Listen at about 30 seconds and again at 2 minutes. The overall loudness is about -12 loudness units full scale, which will be reduced by about 4 dB by some streaming services. The reverb is a bit too dense for the music. I would use a reverb that was somewhat brighter with more first reflection and a shorter decay time, especially on the vocal. The vocal might be better with less reverb. The mix is well done. The only thing that strikes me is that the piano could come up on the song closing segment. I thought the mic choices and placements were good. The vocal sound is particularly nice. Overall, an excellent recording. Next up is Twilight Fall.
Just can't find the light. 50 years gone by, I'm still trying to get it right. Did my own fair share of drinking everybody else's wine. Is it the good and the bad? You're lucky to survive the grind. Still I wonder what it is I hope to find. The tape keeps playing like a voice in the back of my mind. Was a day when it seemed no, I just want it all. But time is strange that way you see now. Now the twilight calls. Once time moves slowly, now I can't outrun my days. Look back on my younger years when I was living in the days. Scarborough gonna shine on through.
It can be a challenge when we record inexperienced players. I do not know the history of the band in this recording, but they sound to me like they have not recorded much and do not know how to make their instruments sound best in the studio. Perhaps they have played together for years, but never really developed their sound. Whatever the background, this situation is always going to be challenging for the engineer. You can't give them years of studio experience in one session, but sometimes you can help them get a better recording. Overall, everything sounds small. This is supposed to be powerful music, but it doesn't sound it. I suspect that this song was recorded and mixed at very high monitor volume, which always makes things sound more impressive. The challenge is to make it sound good at a civilized volume. This could also help explain the lack of mid-range frequencies in the mix, which contributes to the small sound. The overall loudness is close to -12 loudness units full scale, which will make this song sound really small when it is reduced by 4 dB on a streaming service. There are multiple peaks that exceed digital zero. One of the things that an engineer might want to point out to whoever is producing this recording is the drum fills. There's nothing we can do technically, but perhaps it is your job to point out that the fills exceed the drummer's ability to play them in time. If the fills were simplified, they might sound a lot better. Making suggestions like this are fraught with potential bad feeling, so you have to decide if you think the producer and/or the player will accept your suggestion. Be tactful. The guitar and drums might benefit from some room mics, or, lacking that, some creative use of delays and reverb. That would expand the sound and make those instruments sound more powerful. The vocal effect is good and works well with the song. The guitar solo is buried in the mix. I would have suggested to the guitarist that he might try using the guitar sound he used from around 340 to the end, or some variation of it. Another option would be to bring it up in the mix and experiment with effects to make it sound different and stand out. I'm not sure why, but the end cuts off before the last notes end. Trying to get a good performance from inexperienced or non-cooperative or defensive musicians is a classic challenge. We all want to work with only the best players, but often we do not have that luxury. Homecoming. I enjoyed this track. The acoustic guitar sound is good with a nice stereo pickup, but to my ear, the guitar is slightly out of tune, especially in the beginning of the song. This is another area that I think is a responsibility of the engineer. If you hear something that is out of tune, speak up and tactfully suggest the player check the tuning. I believe that is part of our job. The guitar sound is very nice, but it sounds to me like there is a pickup sound mixed in. It may not be that, but that's the kind of sound I hear. It could be a limiter or even a mic or preamp overload on peaks. Whatever the source, it cramps the guitar sound and adds distortion. This is not a major flaw, but I noticed it right away. I'd like to have a better sense of space. If a large room with nice acoustics is not an option, then some artificial space may help. If the space is acoustically good, then moving the mics back a bit will provide more of the room sound. This is a minor point and largely a matter of taste. The percussion is nicely recorded. I try to avoid arrangement comments, but when the shaker comes in, I would have suggested that it be doubled and panned left and right. It is later in the song. The snare at the end is mixed a bit higher than I think is optimum. The peaks exceed digital 0, but the loudness is only minus 18 loudness units full scale. I would back off on the peak level by a couple of dB. The loudness is certainly acceptable for this type of song, so I would not be too concerned about it. But there is an additional 2 dB of loudness available if you want to take advantage of it. The edit at 319 is a bit abrupt. Overall, I was impressed with this track. I like the interesting delay effect near the end. Well done. A Dream Within a Dream. This is an interesting piece of music, and it shows how you can take ordinary instruments and make something unique out of them. People who know me are tired of me saying, "Play me something I haven't heard before." This song does that. The layering of the violas creates an entirely new effect. It is challenging to play a stringed instrument like that, this quietly, and still maintain the desired tone. It is also challenging to record viola with a close mic like this. This piece could certainly appeal to someone looking for that mood for a film or video production. There is good use of delays, and they are nicely in time with the music. The recordist made good use of the stereo stage to separate parts and create a texture with a lot of interest. The percussion is used well, and the subtle use of backwards percussion parts adds to the overall feel. The high bell sound, however, is distorted. This is a very challenging sound to record cleanly, and I suspect most listeners, and probably most engineers, have accepted this kind of sound as representing that high ping kind of bell instrument. I do not know where the distortion on this sound comes from. It could be almost anything in the chain. A condenser mic, mic preamp, processing, or the converter are all suspects. Percussive sounds like this can have surprisingly high transient levels and, of course, extreme high frequency content. Low sample rates can do this too, and this track is recorded at 48 kilohertz, so that could be part of the problem. It's not a major defect, but it caught my attention. The highest peaks are right at digital 0, but the loudness is only -23. I cannot argue with that loudness level since the dynamics need to be preserved and the instruments on this piece are subjectively louder than what the measurements would imply. I would probably back off 1 or 2 dB in overall peak level in mixing or mastering. That may improve the sound for the listener, especially in bit-reduced formats or with cheap A to D converters. This is a very nice recording. O Holy Night. a brass ensemble playing a Christmas song, very traditional. But the approach to this recording is quite different. The instruments were mic'd very close for an intimate sound. I like that, but it also brings up the hissing sound of wind instruments when they are playing quietly and mic'd so tightly. It's not a major problem, and it provides a sense of intimacy that I do like. Real instruments all have their unavoidable mechanical noises that are part of the sound. In most settings, brass instruments are heard from a more distant listener position, and those noises tend to disappear, especially in a room with a lot of reverberation. In this case, it is an artistic decision I cannot argue with, but I did find it slightly distracting. The balance of the instruments is perfect, which implies really good musicians who play together a lot. Or it could be very careful mixing, or a combination, but it creates a wonderful representation of the ensemble in this recording. The recordist gave me some background information on the recording, including that the room was 40 by 80 with a 25-foot ceiling. That's a luxuriously large room for many of us, and if it has good acoustics, it is perfect for this kind of recording. However, I have no sense of the room in this recording. I'm sure that was a conscious decision to emphasize the intimacy, and I believe this is a legitimate trade-off. But my ears were dying to hear more of the room around the instruments. Slightly more distant miking might have helped. I am told a combination of close and distant mics was used, and then time-aligned. I applaud the good use of this technique, but in my experience, the result pretty much negates the room sound. Again, an artistic decision, and I might have come to the same conclusion after experimenting. I suspect this recording would be excellent in an immersive format like Atmos. With all the mics, the mixer would have many perspectives to choose from, and the goal of intimacy in the recording would be wonderful in a surround format. The peak levels are right at 0, which may compromise the sound for some listeners. The loudness measures about -14 loudness units full scale, which could be lower. For this music, I think retaining a wider dynamic range is more important. This is a really nice recording, and I could see it being used in many different applications. Well done. So, there you have the first few submissions. Again, I thank those of you who send in their tracks. I am indeed impressed with the quality recordings you are making. If there is interest in more of these, I am happy to do them if you feel they are useful. Just keep in mind that my observations are based on my taste and experience, and are certainly not the last word. But I try to point out things I think could be improved. Most are minor, but if you only improve something by 1%, it might make a minimal difference. But if you can find several of those 1% improvements, you might turn a nice recording into something exceptional. If you would like to send in your recording for my critique, I'll do some more of these. You can send a full resolution version, not MP3s please, via whatever large file transfer service you like. My email address is dwfearn@dwfearn.com. Thanks. And thank you for listening, commenting, and subscribing. This podcast is carried by over 30 podcast providers, and your subscriptions and reviews help others find my podcast. You can always reach me with your comments and suggestions at dwfearn@dwfearn.com. I am particularly interested in hearing what you think of this critique episode, as well as your suggestions for future topics. This is my take on music recording. I'm Doug Fearn. See you next time.